Hello and welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe who offer exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Hello and welcome back to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg and Kate Silverton. And in this episode, we are going to be talking about how we can, as adults and practitioners, look for those early signs of children demonstrating emotional responses to their environment and also strategies for what we can do to help them to manage those strong emotions. Now, both of us are parents, Kate, and I'm sure if we start with our own experiences, then we can move on to those that people might be experiencing in the classroom. But I think any parent would hold their hand up and say there have absolutely been moments where the children, for one reason or another, have presented them with a behaviour that they just don't know what to do with, and they're often the quite strong, extreme behaviours.
Yeah, I think so. The first, where I come at it from, at least this is how it helped me, is to understand the science of what is going on, which always sounds a bit like, what do you mean science? You know what, this is in my head. But when we think of it as in, this is a physiological response. So, a quick bit of science, and then I'll use a practical example from my own experience when my own son had a big meltdown in public, which, as we all know, is kind of the worst.
They're the best ones.
Yeah. So when we have a stress response, which is essentially our nervous system, which includes our brain, and it is something has happened that the brain says, this is not safe, I don't like it, and then this energy sort of builds up, because what happens is, and I'm preaching to the converted, but everybody I'm sure listening in will know about the fight-flight response. But I like to think of the brain as the lizard, the baboon, and the wise owl. So the lizard is our really ancient part of our brain, the reptilian part, the one that actually where anxiety originates. It's unconscious. It drives our behavior that we have no control over, no conscious control over, certainly our children. So it's, if I crept up behind you in a darkened alley, Alistair, you and did that, you would then respond in that sort of fight flight way. You have that response. Even actually before you'd even heard me coming up behind you, your whole nervous system would be aware of what was going on in your environment and be acting. And then what happens, that lizard, as I imagine it, runs up the tree, this baobab tree that represents the brain in my metaphor. And he tugs on the baboon's tail. The baboon is our limbic system. That's where the amygdala is housed, our brain's fear center. And he tugs on his tail. It's like, something's going down and I don't like it. And then the baboon thinks, hell, this is not great. And he runs across the branch and hits what I imagine is this big red fire alarm, which is the amygdala. When that happens, we are then in emergency. You know, we've got to respond. You get the messages to the hypothalamus, then it goes down to the adrenals. We get adrenaline and cortisol flooding the body, and we are then primed to act. Now, this is tens of thousands, millions of years of evolution in the main, because all animals have fight flight. Now, that happens in a split second. I know you know all of this, Alistair, but just sort of setting that ground, that thing for parents of understanding that when our children blow out, it's a response that they don't have any control over. Now, our job is then to use our prefrontal cortex, what I think of as the wise owl, to then bring them back down and say, it's okay, it's all right. I know that big loud man jumped out at us, but it's actually somebody at Halloween or whatever it might be. Yeah. We help our children and the nervous system to come back into balance. The parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and the body goes back into balance. And that's how we build resilience. So it's not to say the stress response is a bad thing. It's a great thing. It gets our children through the school gate and into the, or into the nursery. It helps them to get in and get on, but they need our help to make sure that they don't get too much of the sort of adrenaline and cortisol. And we need to make sure that that adrenaline and cortisol doesn't sit in the body. It needs to work its way out. If it doesn't, we end up with a tantrum. We end up with a massive overwhelm because the body has to release it. So it doesn't help us a lot of the time to kind of go, okay, all right, well, I've got the science, but how does that work in practice? So as an example, and I wrote, this was one of the ones in the book that parents tell me they most often relate to, in as much as my son was at this lovely forest school, and I'd pick him up every sort of, half day, and he'd run up in his big red suit, kind of running towards me and throw his arms out and everything. And I'd bring him, an apple or something. And I turned up and I was a little bit late. And when I looked over the gate, and I hadn't clocked that right then, but I was late, so I was stressed about being late. He ran towards me, but there was just something off. And this is where we start talking about recognizing the signs. And something was off. We know our kids when they're happy. Yeah. Something was off. But again, I'm stressed. I'm just really pleased to see him. All the other parents were around, loads of mud and rain and what have you. And he looked at me in this snarl. And he saw the apple that I bought, and he went, "I wanted an orange. You never bought me an orange." And that was it. Wow, in the mud, sort of face down. And what happens? My baboon, my limbic system goes, because my lizard and my baboon are going, "Oh, emergency! I am going to be shamed." Shame is one of the most pernicious emotions, as we all know. The shame of being seen as a bad parent, that my kid's the naughty one.
She's on the telly and she can't even control her own kids.
All the catastrophizing and everything that goes on. And in that instant, so I play it through in the book and talk through, my baboon wants to get up and stop being so naughty, or scoop him up from the floor and carry him off kicking and screaming and strap him into the car seat, and everybody has a bad time. So I'm running through all this in my head. Doesn't mean that I don't have these thoughts, but my wise owl really kicks in. And she's like, hang on, everybody, hang on, big picture perspective. He doesn't normally behave like this. Something must have happened. Now, I don't know what it is right there and then. And actually, when we're in a stress response, for our children especially, they can't hear us. It's white noise. They can't. The lizard and the baboon are so primitive. All they're interested in is our survival. So when our children's lizard and baboon are doing backflips, we can't reason with them. We have to use our physical presence to get them regulated again. So in that split second of taking a breath, taking a step back, my wise owl's going, get down on the floor with him. Don't worry about your bloody, muddy knees. Get down. I got down on the floor with him. And all I then felt was this compassion for this little person who was clearly having a massive moment. And I just wanted to understand. Now, in those moments, we can then use our instinct and intuition. And this is the biggest thing I say to parents is we are far more powerful than we know. We can use our intuition. We don't need me or you to be telling people, and then you do this and then you do that. Once we are able to engage our wise owl, she's the problem solving part of our brain, and she can then allow everybody in the brain, and we use our vertical integration, to kind of go, sweetheart. In that moment, we can't use too many words. And at that moment, I just said to him, "Oh, you wanted mummy to bring you an orange." And I got the apple and bonked myself on the head and just said, "Silly mummy, how dare you? You brought me and Wilbur wanted an orange." So as much as I'm not all about distraction, because I think that can take us away from the energy, as you mentioned in the previous podcast, we don't want to sort of stop that energy, but working with it with a little bit of distraction, just to buy myself some time and say to him, we're in this together, right? I'm not going to tell you off. We're in it together. And then you get the eye contact and I'm looking at him and going, "Sweetheart, is everything okay? Can mummy help?" And it's that sort of compassion. So he looks at me, his little baboon's, she's not telling me off. She seems to want to understand what's going on. I still don't know what's going on. He takes my hand, he gets up like in a split second, and he walks off with me. I literally wanted to do a bow. I was like, how did that work? How did that just happen? We walked away, and then I was able to say to him, "Sweetheart, you seem like you had really big feelings there. What was going on?" And he blurted out and he said, I don't name the actual child, but "Max hit me." Ah, right. Yeah. And then he followed up, "And you weren't there." There you go. So his stress response was triggered. There was an emergency, in inverted commas, that his baboon and lizard were like, we don't like being here. We're going to go into fight flight. Mum's not around. I'm too young. I can't go and ask for help from the teacher because I'm only little, 3-year-olds. And then I'm holding it in because I know mum's my safe place and I'm going to come to her, but she's not there. So he's like a little pot that boils over on the campfire. So in that moment, we then can, and I'm like, empathy. I can get in. Oh, my love. I'm so sorry mummy wasn't there. Empathy. We ended up rolling around on the floor in the leaves in that moment, me bonking myself on the head again a few times, making him really laugh then. And that stress gets released because we're wrestling on the floor together. I'm not worrying about how muddy I am in that moment because the magic of me with my boy having got this over this little rupture and actually bonding as a result. Now, again, we can talk about classroom and how we do all of that with more kids, but just as a little example of when we feel empowered, we can override that sense of shame and embarrassment and think, so everybody else watching me, this is about my boy. Something's gone on. And
that takes practice.
It does take practice. Yeah. It takes confidence. But you know what? You do it once. And even if it misses the mark slightly, you get a sense if you're in that intuitive space, and you can get there by doing that pause, remembering, like in the calm moments, remembering this is science. Tantrums are not naughty. There's no such thing as naughty. And then we kind of go, okay, so what else? And all we have to ask ourselves is, what might be going on in this moment? And so that's when we start getting into the asking questions. We can ask Teddy, or we can ask her, do you think you can tell me what's gone on today? So I do find a lot of parents will write to me and say, it worked. It's amazing. And it's that sort of, it ain't easy. It's certainly not simple, but it can be easier.
It's a way of thinking though, isn't it? I think, and when you're in those moments of high stress, it's accepting, as we've said before in previous podcasts, that your baboon also kicks in, and it takes a lot of skill to manage your own baboon, and your alarms are going off. And it is like, if you've ever been in a public building, or even when your own smoke alarm goes off and it's the noise, you can't hear anything else, you can't think, especially if you're somewhere and the fire alarm is going off, you're thinking, is there a fire? Where's the nearest fire exit? Your brain isn't thinking, oh, this, could be a practical outcome to this, blah, blah, blah. And we are adults with the ability to process. So when we're talking about very little children, it's a more extreme version. And sometimes not saying, get up, or get in your buggy, or whatever it may be, is really difficult for a parent. That ability to say, right, I know what's going on here. I just need to take my breath, try and swallow this a little bit. Yeah. And sometimes they will talk to you immediately and they'll say, it was this. And sometimes it's bath time, bedtime, where it suddenly kind of bubbles up and leaks out. And I think as well for parents, sometimes it's, the difference between whether it was a Postman Pat mug or a Peppa Pig mug. And suddenly you've got this massive meltdown in the kitchen because you gave them Peppa Pig when they wanted Postman Pat. And sometimes you've even said, which one do you want? And they'll say, I want Peppa Pig. And you give them Peppa Pig. It's like, but I wanted Postman Pat. And some of that they can't explain to you. They might not say later on in bath time, well, that was all to do with. Sometimes that's just about, I am developing the ability to make a choice. And now I've changed my mind, but I can't express that choice. So it's fascinating and it's complex. And I think what's a real luxury for you and I is to often be on the outside looking in and think, oh, that's really interesting and that's really fascinating. But again, as parents, we both know that when you're in that moment, it feels very different. But having those strategies can massively help you to help your child.
Yeah.
I think, again...
Sorry, I've got something I call SAS parenting for that, which is, so again, with a military husband, you'll appreciate. And I think, I get a lot of dads reaching out. Actually, they love the science because once they get the science, because I think there's this thing, my husband talks about it and I use his example in the book. So I think it's really important to get different parents. It's like, oh yeah, and Mike will say, look, when Kate first started talking to me about this, I thought it was all a bit woo-woo. He comes from the Northeast and quite a hard-bitten council estate. And, it was all like, you do not, what are feelings? And so he will readily admit that it took him a while. But then he said, what happened is he said it was so much easier there was a time when Wilbur wouldn't have a bath exactly for the reason, you can't get to the bottom. And he said it was literally pitting baboon to baboon. He said, I'm a grown man. But he said, in my head, I was thinking, if I give in to him now about not getting in the bath, he'll never listen to me. But, it was something that had happened way before. And Mike said, God, I was battling with him. And actually, it just took you like a matter of seconds to say, sweetheart, what's going on?
Yeah.
And so I think that's the power for me. And so I call it SAS, say what you see. Wow, you are so cross, and matching the energy, not so that you're shouting, but matching the affect of kind of, wow, you are telling me you really want the Peppa Pig mug. And it's quite comical in our heads. I mean, in your own head, you're kind of going, this is ridiculous. But, I'm taking it really serious. You really wanted the Peppa Pig mug. And they almost know that it's quite comical then, because and there's this understanding that almost then happens. So you say what you see, acknowledge it's really hard. You don't know whether you want Peppa Pig or Pinky Perky or whatever the other one was. You don't even know all these decisions. So say what you see, acknowledge whatever it is that feels hard, and then soothe. It's so hard.
And I think it's the soothing bit that people find difficult, because if you do think, I think, again, having been brought up in the northeast of England, when emotion did only occur in a Hallmark card, you never actually said it out loud. Not everywhere. Just I was a very small mining village. Now I'm talking about like 50 years ago. So it was, it was a very much an ethos of you get on with it, you swallow it, you sort it, because you push on and you push on through. So that idea that somebody actually acknowledges the fact that I can see that you are upset, angry, cross, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. So then the other thing that's really important for practitioners and parents is when you are doing this, you're also modeling strategies for life. You're basically saying every time you come up against this, you will learn that rather than go, what you say is okay, and then you begin, that becomes innate in like brushing your teeth. It's just what you do. So even though it might not have been what happened to us in terms of parenting or how we were taught to teach, because certainly none of this was how I was taught to manage behavior at all. I mean, there's a lot of settings will be very familiar with things like behavior charts, which are quite shaming, where you're basically saying, right, you publicly are naughty or you've misbehaved or you've done something, so I'm going to move your peg and put you somewhere else. So this idea that children in early years spaces can very quickly become othered, because as soon as you start saying, oh, you are the naughty child, and I know from being in settings that children will say to you, usually boys, oh, Connor, he's a naughty boy. Yeah. Like, how can you be a naughty boy when you're 4 unless somebody's told you are, or they've told everybody else? So children very quickly become othered, and then they become othered in the brains, not only of their peers, but also the practitioners who kind of see them with a slightly different lens. And the minute you start to see a child as being different, you give them different opportunities, you present them with different possibilities, even if that's subconscious. So I think having that idea that it's not vindictive, it's not against you, and actually the concept of being naughty doesn't really exist. When children do an action, it's to articulate something they can't verbally articulate, so they do it through emotion, behavior, or physicality. Then it takes away some of that idea of saying, well, if I shame you for this behavior that's set outside of my expectation, then you're going to say, do you know what? Thank you for the time to reflect on that poor behavior of mine. I'm not going to do it like that again. When actually the truth of it is we're just stoking that fire, and also taking away the resilience, a lot of the self-confidence, because you've got an adult who's cross with you or an adult who's making you feel bad about yourself. And actually what the adult's trying to do is the antithesis of that and get you to behave. So I think for practitioners, it's about, again, redressing some of the expectations around, like, what is typical behavior expectation for a 3-year-old? And actually we know that there's no such thing as a typical child, so why should there be typical behavior? Surely it's about what you're talking about, which is coaching children through managing emotion, which is why we have a lot of the issues that we do when as adults we're unable to manage that emotion.
Yeah, no, precisely.
And I think at that point, it's another excellent place to stop for just fascinating insights into just the science behind this. And as you said, it's not kind of hocus pocus, and a lot of people think it's a bit like, actually it's based on science and neuroscience, and the more we understand about how children develop, then the more proactive we can be at supporting that development. So that ends this episode with Kate and I, but please join us in the next one where we're going to be talking about how we can talk to children and how we can nurture that resilience through something called the wisdom circle. More about that later. I would just like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Kate, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and Kate Silverton. And if you've been inspired by our conversation today, then don't forget, you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your setting and links to relevant resources.